Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the all-new Mysteries and Disappearances video. Well, I do these videos every now and then, not just when I actually focus on the series itself, but when I come across a circumstance that I think fits perfectly within these set of videos, such as the case this past weekend when I was watching something on YouTube having to do with the most outlandish moments there in boxing, and I came across this gentleman here. Now, he's became known as the Fan Man because of a very unique circumstance that occurred within a very prominent fight a couple of years back. And so in this case, when I was reading his information, because I wanted to know more about this particular man and then why he did this, I realized that what eventually happened to him would be something that I could talk about here within this series, within the Mysteries and Disappearances. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this gentleman now, and then later on I'll explain exactly why I wanted to include him here in this series. But he goes by this name. His name was James Miller, otherwise known as the Fan Man. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating info associated with this man, his exploits, and then again why I wanted to include him here within this series. So who was this James Miller? Well, he was someone that was born back on October 28th, 1963 in Havre de Grace, Maryland. He was born to a family consisting of 3 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters. Eventually they moved about certain areas. In one case, they relocated to Tok, Alaska, and he was able to graduate there from the University of Alaska at Juneau. And then eventually he moved in the 1980s over to Las Vegas. Interesting when I was reading this info, because not only when he moved first to Alaska and then to Las Vegas, how both things would basically intertwine within his most set of infamous acts later in the year. But it was that time in Las Vegas where he actually realized that he wanted to become a paragliding enthusiast. Apparently he had a huge interest in flying ever since he was a young kid, and so there in Las Vegas he was able to do things as far as setting up a jetpack and with his paraglider, and then also putting some kind of aircraft engines as well. And he was doing these things, basically setting records, not just for altitude, but also for distance. But it was at that point, too, that it was discovered that he was someone that was definitely daring when it came to his exploits. He just always wanted to push things further and further and then see where that went. More on that too here in a minute, because it all has to do with one of his most infamous acts. Such was the case whenever it came to the Riddick Bowe versus Evander Holyfield 2 fight. This was actually a fight that I was also watching on YouTube as well. So I'm a huge boxing fan. I love going on YouTube and finding all the older fights that were there, like in the heyday, like in the 80s and the 90s, that were always on pay-per-view, always on HBO, stuff that I never even dreamed of seeing back then, but now I get to do so now, basically for free on YouTube. So in this case, the Riddick Bowe and Evander Holyfield 2 fight occurred on November 6, 1993, and there was in that fight, in the 7th round, that things took a whole other turn. Apparently, this guy, the Fan Man, had been parachuting for a good while, about 10 minutes or so, up in the air, right around that area, right outside of Caesar's Palace. In fact, you would have to see the fight and the area surrounding it to understand how that could occur, because normally, a lot of these fights there in Las Vegas, they're held within an enclosed stadium. I know because, again, I've seen so many of these big, prominent fights there on YouTube, happening in Las Vegas. But in this case, it was something involving an outdoor area. There was a tent that was set up just on top of the actual ring, but everything else, like where the audience was, he was pretty much out there in the open. And so when I was watching this fight, I realized all of a sudden that there was this huge melee that was happening just to the left of the camera. Like wherever the camera was facing towards the ring, something was occurring towards the left. People suddenly started looking towards their left area, and then that's when they saw this. This guy, this Fan Man, had paraglided down straight almost into the ring. Unfortunately, his parachute got caught within some of the overhead lights, and when that happened, he landed pretty much right there, right on the top rope of the ring. And for a few moments, he was almost in the ring itself. Obviously, the entire fight, the Riddick Bowe and Evander Holyfield fight, stopped dead at that point because of the calamity that was ensuing. But there he was, hanging on top of the rope, and he almost went in. But then the fans there, and then also the authorities, started to pull him back. They used a very set of strings attached to his parachute to pull him back, and people were mad. The spectators there, when I was watching it, they were absolutely mad. I was rewatching it over and over because that was a pretty big moment, obviously, like when that occurred, and you could see them pull him into the ground. You could see security officers immediately swarm all the security detail that were there, and for lack of a better term, they basically started to attack him. In fact, you could kind of see how he was pummeled at some circumstances, and this happened for just a little bit. I think it was almost like 20-25 minutes as this was occurring. And then you could see also that his paraglider was being destroyed as well. It was opened, and then there were parts of it that were strewn about. In fact, I was reading later that people were actually cutting some of the ropes or some of the strings tied to the paraglider because they wanted to keep it as souvenir. Clearly, this was something that nobody would ever have foresaw occurring on a big fight like this, but there it was. It occurred. This fan man, this James Miller, definitely circled the area and then intentionally went all the way down into the ring, almost to the ring itself, and then that's where he was taken into custody. In fact, he was taken to Clark County Detention Center, and he was charged with some minimal thing, like it was something along the lines of a $200 bail, just tiny stuff like that, and then he was let go. But afterwards, he gave an interview. Remember, I was mentioning earlier, what was his reasoning? What was that associated with it? And he stated that it was a quote-unquote accident and not intentional. You know, clearly, if it was not intentional, he would have parked someplace else. But in this case, he was there, and that's the reason that he gave associated with him. But if you thought that that was his only big thing, he actually had several other circumstances that he did too. For example, there was the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. Just about maybe 2 months later or so, 1994, in January, he once again used his paraglider to hover around a Denver Broncos, Los Angeles Raiders NFL game. And when he did so, this time he actually landed in the parking lot north of the Coliseum, immediately arrested, but again, let go with some kind of light, very small, kind of like public interference type fine, something like that. And then afterward, he actually traveled abroad. He went to Bolton, England, and then he skydived into a football game that was there, some match that was occurring in the FA Cup. And once again, he was fined, but this time he was actually faced with a 7-day prison. And so after that, he was deported by British authorities. But probably his biggest international act was he also once again paraglided just a couple days later on February 5th, back in 1994, towards the area that was known as the Mall. It looks like it's a large open area close to Buckingham Palace. And then he landed right on top of that. And then he did something else that was considered a little bit more extreme when it comes to removing his trousers. This time he was fined $200, and then he was deported and permanently banned from being in the United Kingdom for life. So you can see that this was a guy that definitely enjoyed doing all these stunts, all these acts. Back then, before Jackass was even Jackass in terms of the show, here was this guy using his propeller, using his paraglider to just be able to do this kind of stuff. Remember I was mentioning earlier, like, why he was doing this, like, what was his reasoning? Before he said that all this stuff was accidental, clearly it wasn't. And later on, he claimed, or others that knew him stated, that he was basically bucking society. He was someone that he knew that people lived by rules, and so he wanted to see what would happen if he would just suddenly make up his own, like almost like make a mockery of the society's rules, just to see how far things could go. And then that's essentially what it was. Like, it was someone that was almost thrilled in terms of making this type of stunts happen when obviously they shouldn't be happening at that time. So as far as his later years, eventually he had to give it up. Apparently he was getting a bunch of death threats, if you can believe that, death threats from a lot of sports fans regarding all of his stunts. And so he ended up moving back to Alaska Alaska. Remember I was mentioning earlier how it seems like before when he was living in Alaska and then later in Las Vegas, how it all just intertwined together. Well, there he was back in Alaska. At one point, he was living almost nomadic, living in a hut with no indoor plumbing. And then he was also teaching lessons when it came to paragliding and then doing what he did. And then eventually he ended up opening up a computer business. But things took a much different, worse turn because in that case, he actually developed some kind of complications. He had some strong coronary artery disease that caused him to get a double bypass surgery, and then there were more complications from it too. He had to have 2 additional surgeries, all of it giving him some kind of a very, very high medical debt. So when that happened, by that point though, I think it was reading that he was actually not married, but he had a girlfriend and she was expected to be due soon. Like she was pregnant, in other words. And so this is where things took a whole different turn. And with the reason why I'm including this here in my mysteries and disappearances. So all these mounting debts and then everything else that had happened before in his life, to him, it seemed like he just couldn't do anything else afterward. Obviously with what he'd done, like with all of his stunts and his acts and his infamy associated with that stuff, he would never be able to get rid of it in terms of his name. And then here he had all these mounting debts from all these huge medical bills from these surgeries that he had. So on one fateful day there in Anchorage, Alaska, or somewhere near there actually, he on September 22nd, 2002, he went to an area that was known as the Resurrection Pass Trail in Chugach National Forest. So I don't know exactly where that's at, but I'll include some pictures of it here. It gives you an idea, essentially, that it's out there in the middle of nowhere. Acres and acres and acres of forest surrounding that particular trail. In fact, I had to look it up. It's almost 7 million, that's right, 7 million acres of surrounding wilderness. So if you get lost in that area, you're probably not going to be found. And that's essentially what he wanted to do. Somewhere in that morning, he decided to go there in his car. He parked his car just pretty much right by that trail and then wandered off straight into the forest. In fact, he was reported missing later that day because obviously he never came back. And so when that happened, a search was given. It was given about a month later on October 13th, but it was quickly stopped because of the hugeness associated with the search. Obviously with 7 million acres, like where do you start? Like there's no chance that you'll be able to find him, especially since he hasn't turned up in over a month or so. So he was legally declared dead eventually after a certain point because of the fact that he went out there and he purposely chose to just walk off straight into the wilderness and never look back. In fact, police later on stated that they thought that he purposely picked a specific area, this trail, so that way it was easy to get to, but then going away from it, he wanted to make sure that his body would not be found at least for a number of years, or if ever at all. And if I wanted to, first guess that came to mind, if I wanted to think like why he did this, again, you have to think about the debt that occurred from him as far as these medical bills, and then you have to think about his circumstances, like the stunts that he pulled earlier. To his mind, he didn't think like he had any other choice. I'm thinking that he did this for insurance purposes. He had his girlfriend, he had his upcoming kid. This was someone that he thought if he was able to find a way to go out there and never be found, then he would be declared legally dead, and then somebody could get, as a beneficiary, all that insurance money. That's the first thought that came to mind, at least on my end, but I wasn't able to find any info related to it. But still, give it about another year or so, or actually about 6 months, and by pure circumstance, a group of hunters were out there in a portion of those woods, and they were just creating their own trail, and they came across his corpse. They came across his decomposing body. And then when there was an investigation done, sure enough, it turned out to be James Miller, the fan man himself. His body was found deep within that forest, and at least there was some closure associated with it. In fact, shortly before his body was found, his girlfriend had actually given birth to their son around that time. And so as far as the discovery of his body, it was a small local bit of news. You got to remember, even though he was given the moniker the Fan Man back in the mid 90s or so, by the mid 2000s, by that point, everyone had seemingly forgotten him. He was almost just a little bit of like the 15 minutes of history as that famous quote says. And so in this case, whenever his body was found, it was just a small local bit of news. And the only time it came to being a national set of news was when there was an anniversary. ESPN was going to talk about his stunt, his 10th anniversary associated with that infamous match that was there between Riddick Bowe and Evander Holyfield. They were going to talk about that fight and the anniversary associated with his stunt, but they couldn't find him. And so doing their research, that's when they discovered that he was found dead, obviously in that forest. And then that's when they gave an update associated with it. But that's pretty much it. That's all the history, the life associated with James Miller, aka the Fan Man. Even to this day, though, like for example, Fox Sports Net has stated his act, his simple stunt, is still considered the #1 most outrageous sports moment when it comes to boxing. And then also The Simpsons. And I remember watching this episode years back, just thinking that it was just some made up thing. I had no idea that they was actually based on real life. But yes, The Simpsons almost paid an homage to him. There was an episode there where Homer took on Drederick Tatum, who is like the Mike Tyson version of the Simpsons character. And then whenever the fight was going on, there was a fan man that came down, and then Moe eventually took that paraglider and then started doing his own rescue missions afterwards. So at least his stunt enabled him to be in a Simpsons episode. So how about that? Not too many people can state that they've actually been part of Simpsons histories, but here he was, in this case, James Miller, part of that history. But if anyone has any more info, anything else I might have missed, please post those comments below. Maybe if someone had more info about his discovery there as far as his body there in the Chugach National Forest, maybe somebody there from the Alaskan area, let us know, please. When I was looking originally at those pictures of that forest, I thought to myself, my goodness, how easy would it be, even if someone is careful about trying not to get lost, how easy it would be to get lost. Imagine if somebody purposely was trying to get lost, there would be no chance. Even if someone changed their mind afterward, like if someone was thinking, you know what, I want to live, they would not have an opportunity to be found again because of how deep that forest goes. But if anyone has any more info as far as his discovery there, that'd be great to hear. But how about that? Still very tragic when it comes to this guy and the way he ended up choosing to end his life. But all right, everyone, thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.